Good afternoon, morning, evening, everybody. This is the March 7th occurrence of the Gateway API Gamma meeting. As a reminder, as we always do, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, so make sure you're being respectful and nice to one another. We do have an open agenda here. A link to that agenda is now posted in the chat of the meeting. So please go ahead and add yourself to that or add an agenda item to that document if you have something you'd like to discuss. Also, we ask that you add your name to the attendees list here on the agenda. I'm going to lead by example. So yeah, put your name and org, and I can't spell when my screen is shared. Put your name and organization in the attendees list, just so we can have a record of who attends and what time zone. And make sure you're adding it to the March 7th instance, not the March 14th instance. So I want to do a quick recap of our previous meeting to get everybody up to speed on what was discussed last time, because you've got two different meeting occurrences in different times, we have different people attending different meetings, so we try to do a recap here. Michael Beaumont shared the Gamma conformance testing plan to get some feedback. This is part of our push to get Gateway API into the, to get Gamma into the next Gateway API release. So I think there is a single detail about adding, Rob had this comment about adding where the tests are going to run, some of the how for the conformance tests. And so I think we're awaiting some changes around that. But other than that, if you've got other feedback, then please add it to this document. To highlight it, the KEP 1880 as something that will be potentially relevant and helpful for codifying gateway to mesh routing interactions right now routing to service in our draft spec. But this KEP in particular creates an IP address resource that might be useful for us to use. I think it would be a really good idea. And in fact, I plan to run through that document at a couple of our future Gamma meetings, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. That'll probably happen after 070 though, and maybe even after KubeCon, because things are getting busy. We've got a couple of open PRs here. One is seeking feedback. I think this is John's PR around codifying standard gateway to mesh interactions. Yeah, for in-cluster specifically. I think, we've got a lot of comments here. I saw John made some changes fairly recently, so going to continue to keep track of that. Opened a discussion in GitHub on failover here, and we had a really good chat about what was being done. I don't believe there is an actual action item from that. We just clarified kind of what the spec means here. And then the last API meeting, like the main meeting, which was the one yesterday, was at 9 a.m. Pacific, testing out alternating meeting time similar to Gamma. Question for Nick, Shane, and Rob: does that mean that the meeting after next also be in the morning, or is that decided?
Not yet.
Okay.
We haven't decided exactly what we're doing yet. The turnout was decent. We want to we're talking about potentially trying to move away from Monday mornings for people. So we'll come back around to it.
All right.
Look, it's going to be very relevant to me in about 4 weeks because I'm going to be in the EU TZ for 3 months in about 4 weeks, starting in 4 weeks. So yeah, having those earlier meetings would be great for me, but I'll figure it out regardless.
How the tables have turned, Nick.
I mean, yeah, I just like taking meetings at stupid hours.
Well, yeah, okay, so more information. Go ahead, sorry, Rob.
No, for the record, we had maybe 60 or 70% of our normal afternoon, Pacific time afternoon attendance in our earlier time slot. So I think one of the ideas we at least consider is maybe doing it once a month instead of every couple of weeks. I don't know. I think what Shane was saying is kind of our next step of let's try something that isn't a Monday morning. Maybe people just hate Monday mornings in general. So if we try that and we get a bit more attendance, maybe it'll be more regular. And especially with Nick switching time zones in a bit, who knows?
Yeah, this kind of segues somewhat decently into some other conversations I've been having. With Gamma and Gateway API both having a meeting each week, it kind of allows for folks to be a part of Gateway API multiple times throughout the week, throughout the month. And so maybe a once a month morning meeting would work because unless you just have a very Ingress specific use case, you could probably get pretty far for coming to the Gamma meetings that are every other week in the morning time slot. So looking forward to seeing how that continues to evolve. I missed one. Rob shared the contributor ladder for the Gateway API set project and asked for solicit feedback from the community. I think was there a time box? I don't think there's a time box for that, Rob.
No, just encourage people to add comments to the doc if there are questions. So far we have, I think, 3 people who have volunteered to start off as reviewers specifically under conformance tests. So that's really on me, on us to first take that doc and turn it into formalized doc in Gateway API repo somewhere. And then next actually add those contributors as official reviewers somewhere as well. So I think those are the next step, but certainly if this is something you want to get involved with, that's the whole point. We're trying to make it easier to get involved in this project. We have tons of opportunities. I know it's been hard to discover how you might fit in. This is trying to make that a little bit easier.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to make it Oh, go ahead, Shane. You're probably going to say the exact same thing.
Sorry. I was just going to say, and yes, and if you're in there and you're like thinking none of this really fits me, but I would like to have a role, we'd like to hear about that too. Like, even if you don't want to comment on the specific stuff in the doc, we want to be inclusive. So make sure that if you're feeling like, yeah, I'd like to have an official role, but nothing in here really suits what I'm kind of thinking, let us know.
100%. Yeah, we want to. There are so many people who've contributed to make Gateway API and Gamma what it is today, and we want to make sure that those folks are able to be recognized for the work they're doing. Okay, so that's our recap. Do we have any questions or comments about the topics we just discussed? All right, awesome. And I kept it within 15 minutes, feeling good about myself today. All right, let's get into our main agenda for today. Nick, want to talk about simplification of policy attachment proposals.
Yeah, look, I think I should preface this. It's been a little while since you raised the policy attachments complex discussion, Keith, but I think it's 1000% fair feedback. I think probably the biggest problem with policy attachment as it stands right now is that it's a bit underspec'd. Well, not a bit, it's totally underspec'd. It's the skeleton for an API that lets you define more APIs. And so it needs to not be a skeleton. So I've opened a PR to that's 1565 to sort of clarify the different types of policy attachment we're talking about. The biggest change is adding a direct policy attachment, which doesn't have the hierarchical notions that the original one did, which I think will be far more useful in like mesh use cases as well as others. And then the other thing that I did was, as part of this, I was like, look, no, I keep saying timeouts are harder than everyone thinks. And people keep saying, surely it's not that bad. So I wanted to make some diagrams that would give people headaches and sort of make people understand where I was coming from. So I opened that timeout skep to sort of start collating that info. I think the good thing about that is that we got the best outcome there. Most people agreed that I'm right, that timeouts are harder than you think, but I also noticed that there is more commonality than we originally thought. So So it looks like there is a path forward there. So that is so I'm kind of waiting on that one to, I want to finish the policy attachment one first, because I don't want to be adding a timeout policy if we haven't like clarified the language about policy attachment. So the timeout policy one is kind of on hold until the policy attachment update is merged. But yeah, to summarize the policy attachment update, yeah, that comment I put at the bottom is basically the summary. There is now a hierarchical policy attachment that has the defaults and overrides like it originally did, and the other one is called a direct one that is that will attach to a single object, or conceivably we might extend it to like a small set that's like a single kind in a single namespace or something like that. But to start out with, it will be to a single object. So yeah, maybe so that one would cover things like setting the TLS parameters for a backend service, perhaps. So that one is relevant for some other issues, and that's one of the reasons why I haven't pushed harder on some of the other TLS stuff as well, as I want to get this done, and then that should unblock a few things. So the current state of it is, currently the original form is called hierarchical, which is, as I think Shane and I were discussing this earlier, he said it's technically correct, which is the best kind of correct, but it is super hard to type. Like I personally have made many typos attempting to type hierarchical. And so I think we need a different name. I had a couple of thoughts there. I think Rob, you gave me a couple of other thoughts out of band that I kind of liked as well. I'll edit the thing. I think what I'm going to do with this for now though, is I'm going to put a big note saying, I'm going to leave it as hierarchical. I'm going to put a big to-do and a note saying hierarchical is not the final name. This will not be the final way to talk about this. We're going to come back and do another PR to change that name. But for now, the concept is going to be the same. It's just going to be the name is going to be different. So I think that's going to be what I do next on this one. But there's still a couple of things I need to add for the site docs. This is mostly reviewable now. So if you want to have a look at this, please do. The main GEP itself is updated. I still need to go back and apply some of these updates to the site docs that talk about policy attachment as well, though. So there is my summary.
Thanks for that update. Yeah, this feels like a really good direction to me. I'm really excited to be able to add simple policies directly to resources without all of the other stuff, if that fits the use case. So yeah, I feel like this is going to give a lot of implementations the opportunity to kind of start from the beginning about, okay, now that we are like 5-6 years more experience, how we go back and set up our policies and our implementation from the beginning, which is going to be very powerful. Great. So I'll add this. I've got this note added to my to-do list to make sure I review this. All right, and the timeout stock. Yeah, looking forward to iterating on that more once the policy attachment gets merged. Did you want to talk about this Envoy Gateway implementation of potentially mentions Envoy Gateway implementation of rate limiting policy? Is this you or is this somebody else?
I think Arco raised that. So and I see he's here. Arco, do you want to have a chat about this one, or is that you raised this one? Or
I'm not sure I did, Nick. Yeah.
So this is just a point that Gateway Envoy Gateway has used we talked about using policy attachment, but ultimately I was not available enough for this one, but I think I agree that ultimately global rate limiting there has been configured using a filter rather than a policy attachment. One of the things that I am changing, one of the other things that I'm changing in that policy attachment change is that originally policy attachment was explicitly said, no, you can't use a policy to configure another extension like a custom filter. I have relaxed that a bit to be like, hey, you can do it, but just be sure you know what you're doing. It's going to be really complicated, and in the absence of us solving the status problem, which is the biggest outstanding problem with policy attachment, it's going to be really hard to troubleshoot if anything goes wrong. I think Envoy Gateway is handling some of this stuff, some of those concerns in a slightly different way. But yeah, I think it is relevant for people to know that this is the way that Envoy Gateway has handled this for now. Costin, looks like you're unmuted.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that it is implementable with both sidecars and client side stuff, and also implementable with the new ambient stuff that Istio is trying to do, and probably others. Because some of those client overrides are very easy to implement in one model, are a bit more difficult to implement in the others. So we need to make sure that, I mean, timeout is an obvious one, we should support it and so forth, but we need to make sure that the semantics are supportable by multiple vendors and implementation. Nothing wrong with the proposal, just want to make, to not jump too much, too many extensions within this that are not implementable by most vendors.
Yeah, again, I think that is a very, very fair point. And I think for policy attachment, the intended flow that I sort of had in mind here was that it's going to be implementations that make policies to start with, and it is expected and normal that an implementation might make a Contour policy or an Envoy Gateway policy or an Istio policy that's only theirs. The idea here is to get people trying those things out and then to have a couple of examples where we can say, hey, let's look at the commonalities here, and maybe we make, Envoy specific ones for all of the people that use Envoy as a data plane, or Nginx ones for people who use Nginx as a data plane, or maybe there are enough commonality here that we can make, extended policies that are included in Gateway API itself. But we're never going to be able to do that until people have actually started making these things and trying them out and seeing what works and what doesn't. I've tried really hard here to make this thing be implementable, but until we actually have people implement it, it's all just a structure that exists mainly in my head rather than a thing that people have actually built and used, which is not where we want this sort of stuff to be.
All right. Do we have any last questions or comments on the general policy attachments topic? All right. In that case, Rob, I'll let you take over screen sharing and hosting.
Cool, thanks. Hopefully this is what's up next. This is Sanjeev's presentation. For anybody who was at the main Gateway API meeting, what was it, a week ago? Sanjeev, you probably remember better than I do when this was presented there.
No, we spent just a few minutes in the Gamma call of 2 weeks ago, and
got
a little bit more in the SIG multi-cluster of this morning.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. So maybe what do we want to focus on today?
Right. Can I get the screen so that I can just pick on the slides that I want to touch on today?
Sure. Yeah, we can do that. If I can remember how. We'll get there eventually.
Either you'll have to make me co-host or enable participants.
Yeah, I don't know if I have sufficient access. I think Keith is the only one who can make you co-host right now.
Let me try that. Sanjeev. Okay, so Sanjeev, I'm going to make you co-host, and then Rob, I'm going to make you host. That was my mistake.
Oh, cool.
Extra credit, Sanjeev, if you just put your camera to your screen.
All right, everything should be good to go now.
Perfect, thank you. And Sanjeev, about how much time were you looking to spend on this?
10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, so that sounds good.
Okay, so yeah, this was very briefly discussed last time, but the takeaway was to provide the link to make the document public. At that time, it wasn't public. I made it public since then. I don't know if any of you got a chance to look at it, but I also then shared it in the SIG multi-cluster this morning. And this is a somewhat broad topic, and it essentially includes a few subtopics within it. So one of the things that I would welcome the community input on is how to, I mean, I have some thoughts on how to carve it up and how to take it forward, but definitely open to your guidelines, your guidance and suggestions. So I'll summarize the asks at the end. So what this is doing is that, okay, let's just revisit almost like what is the model we have for multi-cluster service networking. And a lot of the projects have sort of implied models. There are some explicit models like the Kubernetes multi-cluster services API, which have their own pros and cons and may need further extensions. But then individual service meshes like Istio and Linkerd and others, they've had their own sort of multi-cluster models like single network, multi-network, primary, remote, and all these things. And these tend to be somewhat not always consistent. So let's, and that's the motivation here. And then I'll talk about the next set of tasks and which working groups we should use those to forward those tasks. Okay. So yeah, the work here is relevant to things like the MCS API from SIG multi-cluster, the Gateway API, the Gamma APIs, and all of the various service mesh projects. So as, of course, the members of this group know very, very closely, there's this general movement towards providing common Kubernetes native APIs for any kind of multi-cluster networking function, as opposed to several, the individual service mesh APIs, and things like Project Gamma and the adoption of Gateway API for service meshes and MCS API are all efforts in that direction. But as a consequence, we've had some gaps. So I tend to have busy slides, so I'm not going to go over all of them. Hopefully you'll get a chance to look at them, but I'll touch on a couple of examples, right? So one is that service meshes tend to have, implied multi-cluster services discovery. A service named foo in one cluster in one mesh is implicitly bound to service of the same name in the same namespace in a different cluster of the service mesh. For example, the service meshes, like Istio, for example, it is supported with single network and multi-network models. But when we've tried to do multi-cluster extensions to native Kubernetes, for example, we tried to introduce Kubernetes network policy and see what needs to be done to make it multi-cluster. One of the feedbacks from the SIG network community was, okay, that should focus only on single network models. But in that case, network policy wouldn't cover the needs of network policy for Kubernetes native service meshes. So you see that there is a disconnect in the modeling and assumptions of the multi-cluster network between these different projects. And so one of the goals of this presentation is to highlight this point and kick off definition of a reference multi-cluster model that all the projects can design towards or design against, so that we don't get into these inconsistency kinds of things. And whether that's an extension of the Kubernetes MCS API or so, that remains to be seen. So I'll skip over these slides here, but I'll just illustrate, for example, okay, so what are we proposing here? So the proposal here is that we define an overall reference model for multi-cluster service networking, building on what's already been done. And once we have this reference model, going back to individual sub-features, things like multi-cluster policy, multi-cluster load balancing, and seeing what additionally remains to be done to work within that model that we define. So what are the kinds of questions? So that's the proposal here, the big thing. So which is define a model and go back to each feature to see what it needs to do further to meet that model, right? That's the overall proposal. Now, in the specific question of the model, the questions to be answered include things like, okay, should a cluster set, which is an MCS API concept, should it be identical to or exactly congruent with a service mesh? It would appear that should probably not be the case, but nowhere has this been explicitly stated. And some people have sort of implied that that should be the case because both of them require namespace sameness. So it suggests that a cluster set should be identical to a service mesh, but a cluster set is really about cluster controls that you typically want to give that control to a cluster admin, whereas service mesh, you typically want to give control to an application admin that knows the application topology across meshes, and the application topology need not be tied to the cluster topology. So that's an example of a disconnect on the modeling assumptions. Similarly, should the model support a single network within each cluster set or mesh, or should it support multi-network, right? Policy discussions so far have suggested we should support single network, but service meshes like Istio support multi-network. And so we have to agree on it so that we don't end up defining two versions of policy, one just for Kubernetes and one for Kubernetes with service mesh native APIs. So you can see that there's a bunch of things here. Again, I'll let you look at it later. Rob, yeah, go ahead, please. You have a question.
Yeah, just on that one point about whether, you know, it should support single network or multi-network. I think this is, I mean, these are all really good questions, to be clear. But one thing I want to highlight, at least from my perspective on Gateway API, and anyone can feel free to correct me, but I feel like Gateway API is not trying to solve all the world's problems here. And so, you know, we can specify what it looks like for, say, single network or for the current state of the world with multi-cluster service API without necessarily preventing multi-network from being a future addition. Or, you know, I feel like just by defining how one thing works, we're not precluding a more advanced concept from working in the future. So just, you know, we could just pick one is what I'm saying to start with.
Yeah, agreed. And in some cases that is possible, but in some cases we have seen a disconnect. For example, when we were trying to have a proposal for policy where if you assume you can't just start with a single network policy and then extend it to multi-network, because you have to know your model from the beginning. So in some of these features, it could be possible to work with the current MCS API, and that does not preclude any future enhancements if we need a model broader than the current MCS API. But that's not true for all these features. And secondly, even the MCS API itself has had pretty limited adoption. So it is well worth our while to look at what has hampered that adoption, and maybe the crux of the effort would be to either enhance the MCS API or have something equivalent. So you're right. This is not saying that we cannot proceed with the models that we have currently, but it would appear that we might go off in different directions that are hard to reconcile if we don't be more explicit in the model. This is just a thought. You know, some people in segment multi-clusters seem to agree with that, but this is open for discussion. And you know, if we feel that is not the case, then we don't need to redefine a model. This is just a proposal at this point. So I'll skip through the rest of it. I've got some topology pictures on what we mean by different kinds of models. Here's one
Actually,
example.
just
Yeah.
sorry, just while we're
Yeah.
still here, I think Costin had a hand as well.
Yeah, Costin, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to clarify a bit. We have a separate, similar discussion in Istio about the semantics of.
You're really quiet, Costin.
Cluster. Oh, sorry. Let me see if I can. Can you hear? Sorry, I'm on my phone, so.
Oh yeah, much better.
Okay, so in Istio, we're having similar discussion about the semantics of multi-cluster, but I think one important thing is to start with requirements. I mean, for example, requirement that cluster local, for example, has a semantics that do not break when mesh is adopted, which I think is very important. Then decide what are the common things that we want to the minimal viable things that we need to express, like the fact that a service is spanning multiple clusters. Policy should have the requirement, obviously, that they work regardless of how many clusters you have. And then we can go into details. I mean, if you have multiple networks or not. But yeah, I agree with that. If we try to do too many things, and it will be very difficult to make progress and to get adoption.
Yeah. So requirements is synonymous with model definition, right? We don't want to do everything all at once or sort of spread too broad, but it does seem worthwhile to look at the aspects of modeling that should be done upfront, so that different projects aren't ending up in inconsistent places. And we've seen that before, right? I mean, for example, this single network versus multiple network topic, or cluster sets versus meshes. So it seems useful to have at least one relatively one piece of effort in just being a bit more precise on the multi-cluster model. This is also related with the fact that the MCC API has seen pretty limited adoption. So there have been some challenges, right? And that have to do with the way it, requires namespace sameness and couples admin control, cluster scope admin controls with application scope. So it does appear, we're open to discussion, but it does appear that there's some amount of modeling revision would be helpful. And as you said, similar discussions are happening within Istio. But open to feedback. Let's look at it both ways and see whether it makes sense to refine the model or be more explicit about the model. Yeah. So this.
Just a quick time check. I think
Yeah.
maybe if we can wrap this up in around 5 minutes. Does
Sure.
that work?
Sure. So, okay, I'll just mention this one slide and then just go to the conclusion slide. So please look at it and feel free. And this is supposed to be just open work. So whoever is interested, please contact. We can all work together on this. So a possible model that we might conclude based on, let's say, a first pass at combining the Istio multi-cluster model with the multi-cluster services API model could be that a cluster set and a mesh are identical. Of course, there's good reasons for that not to be the case, but for now, let's assume that. So but this is not stated anywhere. So we would need to explicitly state that if you are trying to do if Gamma is trying to provide a service mesh-like service for the same kinds of deployment models that Istio is targeting, but wants to do that in the context of an MCS API, then we would have to have some relation between cluster sets and meshes. One relation could be they are identical. The other one could be that they're non-overlapping because of they're having different admin scopes. But then in the Istio model, you can have multiple networks within a mesh or possibly cluster set if we were to make that extension. But the efforts to do defined network policy were initially scoped within a single network. So you wouldn't, if we had gone down that without trying to have a common model, we would have not had a usable policy for this model, right? So that's an example of the disconnect. So in that's an example where you want to agree on the model before you kick off different projects for features like policy versus load balancing and so on. So the next one is, I think Rob is going to cover this in the very next topic. So I'm going to skip over that. And, this is the policy topic, which I just discussed. So let's just go to the conclusions and next steps and what what the ask is here, right? So the proposal here is that we document a reference model for multi-cluster service networking. And that is of interest to both this working group as well as Gateway API, SIG network, and multi-cluster. Which group we do it in, or whether we bring it across multiple groups, that's open, right? It would appear that a lot of the service mesh leads tend to attend this working group, so we need your input here. The way I look at it is that this is defined by what are the multi-cluster needs for the various service networking projects, whether they be Istio or Linkerd or Cilium or Console, and then have a KEP or a GEP which defines a model that works for that meets all their requirements, or as many as possible, and then decide whether we need additional enhancements to policy or load balancing or service discovery in the context of that model, and that would be separate GEPs or KEPs. So this is one proposed way to break it up, maybe have a KEP on the model, and if needed, subsequent KEPs. If you guys, so I would like to know whether you guys agree with this sort of approach. And if you're interested in working, then I'm happy to collaborate. I'm happy to spend some time on documenting this model as well. So that's really it. So any quick feedback on whether this is a reasonable way to proceed, and any interest in collaborating on this? And also which working group to work it through, or we work offline, produce a draft KEP, and then bring it to one of these working groups.
Yeah, this is such a massive area. It's hard to find the right process and procedure for going forward. I know we've struggled in Gateway API even with moderately sized gaps, getting them to push forward. Like policy attachment is one that Nick was presenting on earlier that feels smaller in scope than this, but has also been sufficiently large that it's been hard to push forward. I basically I'm trying to say that I don't know that we have I don't think we've solved this. That's what I'll say. I am very open to ideas on improving this. At a high level, we have had the best success when we've been able to split out ideas into smaller concepts. So instead of trying to tackle everything, if we could say, not to pick on just one thing, but like, what does it look like for the cluster set and service mesh overlap? Can we just work on defining that a cluster set and service mesh are either identical or different? And, if we can take these bits apart and work on them in relatively small chunks, I feel like we might be able to push things through a little bit faster. But I know, I appreciate first off that you're bringing this up and asking really good questions. I don't have great guidance other than, maybe if we can split this up into smaller pieces. I think that all the groups you mentioned here, the SIGs and sub-projects, all are relevant. And so barring another meeting, we probably will just kind of have to circle back and forth. From my perspective, the ingress side is relatively straightforward, at least right now. So I think the mesh, so Gamma and SIG multi-cluster, are going to be the two most interested sides of this. Yeah, that's a bunch of thoughts, but I'll hand it off because I feel like others want to say something too.
Why do you feel that ingress is different than Gamma? I mean, I think we are in agreement that if HTTP route allows service import to be used as a backend, Gamma would follow suit. There is no difference in behavior. And if you define that, if ingress defines the semantics of clustered local to be local, I don't see any reason Gamma to be different. And those two things could be pretty quickly agreed on and moved forward relatively fast.
Yeah, I generally agree with you. I would say there's two things that make it a little bit more complicated. One, this idea that right now it's possible for a mesh, the group of connected clusters under a mesh to be different than a cluster set. Adds some level of complexity. And then two, I think the idea that with Ingress, we don't have a whole lot of prior art when it comes to multi-cluster networking. And what we do is largely consistent with the Kubernetes API. Whereas with mesh, what we have is generally not consistent with the multi-cluster service API. So it will take more work to bring existing implementations towards whatever we set, as a standard in Kubernetes, specifically Gamma.
I understand your concern. So again, I think it's something we need to do in either way. So to make sure that any mesh is consistent with Kubernetes, and I mean, Istio being slightly off and having compatibilities created a lot of problems for both Istio users and Kubernetes users. So I think we are at least, I don't know, I speak for myself, but I think we're pretty committed to, align and to be consistent with Kubernetes. And so the mesh works the same way as other meshes and as Kubernetes. And that's a very good start. I mean, fixing the semantics of cluster local and cluster set local and aligning on the things that are probably common across every mesh. I mean, I know Linkerd, for example, is, I just looked at their implementation and it's also kind of similar, except the user annotation. So I don't think we will have troubles moving fast on at least the most common features.
Rob, one quick thing. Does anybody else have any comments? I'll just add one quick thing here about sort of breaking up the tasks here. So one proposal here is sort of a cap on the model and then caps on individual features like discovery or policy or whatever. And that's also the way the MCS API was introduced, right? The MCS API was one cap, right? Which had a certain model of cluster services. So in that granularity, it might be okay to have the first chunk of work be what's highlighted here, which is this. But I think you might be proposing an even finer granularity, although that's not how this MCS API was sort of defined, right? It was, here's a possible model, and then, yeah. So
I think,
yeah, and I think that comes from the bias of how Gateway API has done things. I know Gateway API and MCS have acted a little bit differently. MCS has evolved and worked through a single cap, and Gateway API, we have a series of smaller gaps that make up the state of the API. So our bias has been so far to work on smaller pieces and kind of form them together into something larger. But I think I cut off Nick, so maybe I'll let you keep on going.
Yeah, I think what Rob says is fair. Our bias is about what our experience has been. Like Rob's and my particular experience has been working on Gateway API for like 4.5 years now. Right. So and what we found is that when we've tried to do bigger things like this, so many people have so many opinions that correlating all of those opinions together into one, like getting everybody to agreement, can be really difficult. But if you start out with smaller chunks that people can agree on and get everyone so that everyone is talking about things in the same way on the smaller chunks, then you can use those smaller chunks to build up a bigger thing. And so like, I don't dispute that anything you're saying is unreasonable or stuff that we don't want to do. It 100% is. But I think that one of the things that I have found working on Gateway API is that a lot of the time people will use the same word for a thing that is actually different. And nobody will know because everyone is using the same word until you get down into some detail thing and people are like, oh, when you say backend, you actually mean blah, 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 and yeah. And the point of sort of breaking out and finding the commonalities first lets you sort of do some of that work initially to try and get everybody as close to the same mental model as you can. I mean, you absolutely can do it with what you're doing here with sort of established sort of top down building a model. But what we have found is that the amount of bandwidth cognitive bandwidth required for somebody to sit down and process an entire like long doc with a really big model that's very comprehensive is so large that it's very easy for it to fall to the bottom of people's priority tree, and it can take a really long time to build consensus. Whereas if you doing the sort of thing that Costin is saying, where you're taking like the chunks that you are pretty sure everyone is close to agreement on, then you build those first. And then you find in the process of building those, you find the bits that people don't agree on, and you defer the bits you decide on the bits you can, and defer the bits you can't. And then that's how you sort of agglutinative build an API sort of more from the bottom up, rather than building a really big API from the top down, which in the case where we've got pre-existing implementations like you do for mesh that have, like, most of the different meshes, as you say, have a way of doing some sort of like multi-cluster already. Like Cilium has its own cluster mesh that works in a slightly different way to some of what everyone else does. But it does work, right? And so and that's a good example of where you starting from the common things means that everybody can agree, yes, that's what we want to do, and then building up the model from the smaller building blocks that you've had everyone or mostly agree on means that it's easier to build consensus for something much larger.
Yeah, totally agree. And I do think that what we would document first would be fairly consumable. It would sort of focus on really these two questions which I'm highlighting here, right? So forget about policy and load balancing and all of that other stuff for now. Those are follow-on pieces. Two very basic questions are, is a cluster set congruent with a mesh? Are we dealing with single networks or multiple networks within a cluster set or mesh? That itself is a pretty key model definition that we need to agree on. Then subsequent other KEPs can talk about policy or load balancing, whatever. So I know I combined several things here, but if you net it down, the first KEP we're talking about is not that big. It is really addressing primarily these two questions. But anyway, I think we've gone on quite a bit.
Yeah.
Happy to go on to the next topic, but open to your feedback. Please provide comments. Looks like Mike has started with something, so appreciate any feedback you get. And any interest in working, collaborating, please reach out.
Great, thank you. And I would say I agree with those two as starting points. I especially agree with the cluster set one as a very important one to define. I'd love to see it. I think the best starting point is a KEP that comes back to a multi-cluster service KEP, but we can work through. The key thing is we have a doc somewhere that everyone can review. Where it lives is less important. This feels very relevant to Gamma, so I feel like starting it as a KEP under there maybe makes sense, because we're basically defining specifically what mesh's interaction is with multi-cluster services. I don't know.
Yeah, so I'm happy to draft an initial document, and we can take it wherever we want, and whoever wants to collaborate can collaborate.
Right.
And I like Costin's comment on the chat. It says, we don't even know what a mesh is. Okay.
Yeah. Well said. All right. So the very last thing. Oh, not quite the last thing. Sorry. I missed that we had a couple things on here. So I'll be awfully quick. You have probably seen, many of the people on this call have probably seen this doc already. This is a doc that I presented at the Gateway API meeting yesterday, as well as the multi-cluster meeting earlier today. So I won't focus too much on it, but what I would say is the high level idea here, if this were to turn into a KEP, which is the goal, is anywhere where you can use service within Gateway API today, you can use service import. And the distinction is a service refers to cluster local endpoints, and a service import refers to endpoints within the cluster set. That's the TLDR of the entire thing. It's just saying, hey, anywhere you can use service, you can use service import. I would have extended conformance. And yeah, this is exactly what I'm proposing. I think the mesh side of things may be a little bit more interesting, and certainly more interesting for the scope of this call. I know that many meshes today don't make any kind of distinction between cluster local and cluster set endpoints. I know cluster set wouldn't necessarily be the right term here, but whether the endpoints are within the same cluster or just within the mesh somewhere is not a distinction that many meshes make. That is something this GEP proposes. I would like some, feedback on this idea, but I think this kind of goes hand in hand with the ideas that Sanjeev was already talking about. And, I think what I'm proposing here is just kind of one of a series of GEPs related to multi-cluster and gateway API. This feels like a reasonable starting point, but this certainly does not answer every question, as Sanjeev is pointing out. So yeah, feedback welcome. I won't spend too much time on this because there is one more item from Shane, but just be aware of this. Please add comments. I am intending to turn this into a GEP PR sometime soon, and we can continue the discussion there. Yeah, that's all I've got on this one. All right, any quick comments before we move on? All right, I will keep on going. Shane, this one is all you.
I'll be really super quick. There is a provisional GEP for conformance profiles, which includes conformance levels is what we used to call this. It includes conformance reporting. It does not currently have a whole lot of mesh stuff in it. We refer to the fact that we will do conformance profiles for mesh, but we don't have mesh tests currently. So I just wanted to make sure this is on people's radar. That's it. Take a look at it. Please do feel free. I would very much encourage you to add changes like PRs and stuff for things that you want to see change. If you wanted to add some context about things that you want to see in mesh, it'd be fair to add it here. But that's it. Just kind of putting it on radar, especially with Beaumont's doc recently. Just keep it in mind that we're kind of doing this right now for the core gateway stuff.
Yeah, and thank you, Shane, for the update. I just want to highlight again, a key goal with all of this conformance work is we're trying to get to a point where we have some kind of global visibility into who's conformant with what features that can help, drive decisions about what features are ready to graduate to the next level, and it can also help, us understand the health of the ecosystem. What kind of delay is there between us introducing a feature to the API and implementations being conformant with it? Yes. I think this is going to be huge. Really appreciate everyone who's been working to push this forward. And yeah, please take a look.
We will be able to reduce our dependency on Slack queries to know who's doing what.
Right. Yeah, I think that's it. We even have a couple minutes left. So thank you, everyone. With that, it sounds like we've got lots of follow-ups. So we can continue discussions in Slack, on GitHub, wherever. But yeah, thanks for great discussion. Have a great rest of your week.
Cheers, everybody.
Yeah.